Chapter 3. Entropy and Social Theory. Quote, "Now, however, a new worldview is about to emerge, one that will eventually replace the Newtonian world machine as the organizing frame of history. The entropy law will preside as the ruling paradigm over the next period of history. Albert Einstein said that it is the premier law of all science. Sir Arthur Eddington referred to it as the supreme metaphysical law of the entire universe. The entropy law is the second law of thermodynamics. The first law states that all matter and energy in the universe is constant, that it cannot be created or destroyed. Only its forms can change, but never its essence. The second law, the entropy law, states that matter and energy can only be changed in one direction, that is, from usable to unusable, or from available to unavailable, or from ordered to disordered." End quote. Jeremy Rifkin. Is there any relationship between men's worldviews and the kind of science they adopt? Probably there is. Henry M. Morris suggests that one reason why today's younger defenders of evolution have begun to abandon the neo-Darwinian synthesis of slow, organic changes is that they were educated during the radical 60s. Revolutionary Marxism had been a quiet but effective intellectual force throughout the 1960s on many campuses. His chapter title is Evolution and Revolution. It therefore seems fair to ask this question of the creation scientists. Is there any relationship between the kind of defense offered by one generation of six-day creationists and the overall worldview that they hold? I suggest that there are such relationships. A more important question is this one. Is there any relationship between the eschatological views of one group of creationists and the type of intellectual defense they adopt? I think there is. Finally, is there a relationship between one's eschatology and one's overall social outlook? I think there is. That is the topic of this chapter. Natural science and social theory. The question inevitably arises, can the so-called law of entropy be applied in social theory? Such attempts are questionable. Those who rely heavily on the entropy theory in their cosmological explanations also tend to produce pessimistic social theories. It is my contention that 1. Their pessimism is their presupposition, and 2. Pessimists sometimes adopt certain quote-unquote entropic cosmologies in order to support their pessimistic theories. Thus, what appears to be a conclusion, social pessimism, is in fact an original presupposition. For over 6 years, the evangelical world has remained silent in the face of Rifkin's books, except when the response has been somewhat favorable. I believe that this silence has prevailed in large part because evangelical scholars share Rifkin's interpretation of entropy, his use of natural science in developing social theory, and his underlying pessimism regarding history and man's part in it. Evangelicals may not be comfortable with his economic and political conclusions, but they are even more uncomfortable in challenging them, given their own shared frame of reference, his pessimistic worldview. The resurrection. What the evangelical world has failed to emphasize is that the doctrine of Christ's resurrection is the unique New Testament doctrine that should be the starting point in Christian social theory. Creation, rebellion, resurrection, and restoration. Here is the Bible's message of hope and transformation in history, not just for individuals but also for societies, that must become the basis of Christian social theory. The New Testament has given us a new understanding of the plan of God for history, and the doctrine of Christ's resurrection is at the heart of this perspective. Without this doctrine, Christians have nothing. Paul is adamant. He even repeats his argument, which he rarely does in his letters, concerning the resurrection and the validity of Christian faith. But if there be no resurrection of the dead, then is Christ not risen. And if Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain. Yea, and we are found false witnesses of God, because we have testified of God that he raised up Christ, whom he raised not up, if so be that the dead rise not. For if the dead rise not, then is not Christ raised, and if Christ be not raised, your faith is vain. You are yet in your sins. 1 Corinthians 15:13-17. Christian faith without the resurrection of Christ in history is vain faith. Our apologetic methodology inevitably influences our general outlook. Should we begin with the Bible, or with a 19th century version of classical Newtonian physics? I contend that we should begin with the Bible, and specifically with the resurrection, rather than with the fall of man in the garden. It is Christ's resurrection, not Adam's fall, that is the dominant theme of the New Testament. To use the second law of thermodynamics against the evolutionists as the bedrock doctrine of Christian apologetics is to weaken the case for Christianity. The second law of thermodynamics. The second law has been used by creation scientists to argue that evolutionists have not been consistent in their devotion to the second law, which they virtually equate with science as perhaps science's most universal law. There are several problems with this strategy. First, many modern scientists have begun to abandon the universality of the second law or to apply it in radically unorthodox ways. Boltzmann's example, Chapter 2, is just one among many. Second, Darwinists constantly appeal to the quote-unquote open system character of life on Earth, and they remind the creation scientists that the law applies only to closed systems. They never admit the validity of the creation scientists' use of the second law, and they accuse the creation scientists of not being scientific because they ignore quote-unquote open systems. The debate goes on like two endless loop cassette tapes playing at each other. At best, to appeal to the second law as anything more than a convenient way to expose the possible scientific inconsistency of the evolutionists, and thereby to help strengthen Christians' confidence in creationism, is to grant too much authority to modern science. The problem is that this seemingly convenient argument, which somehow never convinces our evolutionist opponents, has in some cases been taken so seriously by Christians that they have followed Rifkin's example and have begun to construct Christian social theory in terms of the second law of thermodynamics. When we see where Rifkin's approach is taking us, we should reconsider this application of classical physics to society. It is far better to rely on the Bible to provide us with our foundations of social theory. Whenever anyone uses quote-unquote neutral physical science to support any social theory, he faces the problem that a radically unneutral humanist worldview undergirds modern physical science. An alien worldview can too easily be quietly imported into Christian social theory when Christians use modern science as a supposedly common ground basis for the construction of social theories. Christians give away too much to the enemy when they begin with humanism's science to construct their worldview. 1. Creation science's social pessimism. I am arguing in this book that there is a serious danger to Christianity when Christians try to use the second law of thermodynamics to justify a particular social theory. Let me cite an example from the world of scientific creationism. In a flyer produced by the Bible Science Association and the Genesis Institute, same address, we read the following, quote, "The creationist realizes that the world is growing old around him. He understands that things tend to run down, to age, to die. The creationist does not look for the world to improve, but to crumble slowly, as in erosion, decay, and aging." End quote. This is a philosophy of self-conscious defeat, a cry of despair. It is also not the kind of philosophy that anyone would normally choose to use to challenge the Marxists in Latin America. The whole idea is wrong-headed. First, the entropic process of cosmic physical decay takes place in humanist timescales of billions of years. Such a timescale is irrelevant for social theory, Christian or pagan. Societies do not survive for billions of years, not so far anyway. I shall return to this theme when I deal with Rifkin's writings. Second, What does it mean to say, quote, "the world will or will not improve," end quote? What world? The geophysical world? What does an ethical or aesthetic term such as improve have to do with the physical world? Scientific evolutionists have been careful to avoid such value-laden adjectives with respect to historical geology or biology, at least until man appears on the historical scene and begins to affect his environment. Without a moral evaluator, there can be no meaning for the word improve. Christians should be equally careful in their use of language. The Christian should argue that God evaluates any improvements or declines of the external world, and therefore men, acting as God's subordinates, also make such evaluations. But there is no autonomous, impersonal standard of quote-unquote world improvement, as any evolutionist readily admits. So the flyer apparently had as its point of reference not the geophysical world, but rather man's social world. This immediately raises a crucial question. How do the operating standards of man's social world relate to the physical process of entropy? This is the question that scientific creationists have generally avoided, and when they have on occasion said something about it, they have sounded like Jeremy Rifkin. Rifkin's tactic. Rifkin has fully understood this. He uses it against his fundamentalist Christian reader. He appeals directly to premillennial eschatology in creating the case for social pessimism. He also appeals to the creation scientists' use of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. In fact, he sounds as though he is paraphrasing Henry Morris. Quote, "Interestingly enough, the creation story directly parallels the two basic laws of thermodynamics. According to Genesis, God's order is fixed. He created everything that exists at one moment in time. Similarly, the first law of thermodynamics states that all matter and energy in the world are constant and fixed. That is, they can neither be created nor destroyed." End quote. Then he goes on to link his pessimistic worldview to premillennial or amillennial pessimism regarding human history and also to the second law of thermodynamics. Quote, "Evil is synonymous with the forces of chaos and disorder. History, in theological terms, is seen as a long and protracted war in which the forces of evil continually attempt to enlist the help of fallen individuals in their battle to spread chaos in God's world. The forces of evil win most of the battles, but ultimately lose the war. That is, with the help of sinful people, they succeed in creating more and more disorder in the world until Christ's return once again to earth. God then triumphs over evil at this climactic moment of history, and the world, which the evil forces have churned into complete and utter chaos, is transformed back into God's kingdom. The second law of thermodynamics posits a similar view of history. It states that all matter and energy were created in this original state with an order and value to them. That ordered state is continually being eroded by an irreversible natural process. According to the law of entropy, all matter and energy are constantly and without exception moving from an ordered to a disordered state." End quote. This is a clever technique. First, appeal to the familiar pessimistic eschatologies of the readers. Second, use the familiar language of the creation scientists regarding the laws of thermodynamics. Third, remind them of the futility of seeing God's kingdom operating in history, thereby removing any hope of a progressive removal of entropy's curses. Throw back at them their traditional pessimism. Quote, "The evangelical would argue that while only God can usher in the kingdom, reverse the process of entropy and remake the world, each person still has a responsibility during his lifetime to serve as a witness to the coming of that kingdom. Serving witness means respecting and protecting God's created order to the fullest, even while knowing that all of one's efforts are ultimately insufficient to the task." End quote. Rifkin's quote-unquote witness is a person who struggles against the inevitable forces of decay. He is doomed to failure in history. Here also is the heart of amillennial and premillennial social pessimism. Yet Rifkin chides premillennialists for giving up on the world. Quote, The premillennialists view history in much the same way as the second law of thermodynamics. However, their overriding preoccupation with arriving as quickly as possible at the end of history, God's return, precludes any serious service as stewards over God's created order. Their attention has become so riveted on anticipation of the coming of the kingdom and saving as many souls as possible in the remaining time that they have left God's created order unguarded and unprotected. In not honoring their covenant to God to serve as stewards, the premillennialists are acting in direct rebellion." End quote. He challenges them to become stewards. How can they do this? By adopting his philosophy of anti-growth and anti-science. How do we slow down this universal evil, meaning the entropy process? By abandoning most Western technologies. Quote, "Technologies, after all, are designed to speed up the entropy process by more progressively using up the stock of available matter and energy in the world." End quote. Rifkin is attempting to reduce Christians' resistance to his theories by making them feel guilty. He chides them for becoming consistent with their eschatological pessimism. He calls them to a life of sacrifice, despite guaranteed failure. This strategy of guilt manipulation is an effective means of producing a program for your enemy's cultural paralysis. Simple to complex. The creationist quite properly challenges the evolutionist to explain how it is that an increasingly complex and increasingly orderly world could have evolved from a random, quote-unquote, noisy, creatorless, lifeless world. Evolutionists feel the heat of this question. Someday they will be subjected to a lot more heat. Isaac Asimov has gone so far as to say in a footnote response to an essay written by scientific creationist Duane Gish, quote, "Astronomers do not believe the universe began in a disordered, chaotic state. It began, in fact, in a condition of high order. A departure from this order, an inhomogeneity, led to the formation of stars and galaxies in accordance with the second law." End quote. This is an astounding statement. He is saying that the quote-unquote cosmic stuff of the legendary Big Bang was highly ordered. No molecules yet, but more highly ordered than molecules. No organic life yet, but more highly ordered than organic life. This boggles the mind of the average person who, unlike Asimov, is unable to write 2 books a month. Asimov does not tell us which astronomers have said this. He also does not mention how this highly ordered system started or what it was. He does not because he cannot. But this is supposedly irrelevant. In the standard false humility side of modern two-faced science, he adds, quote, "Scientists do not know how the condition of high order began, but scientists are accustomed to lack of knowledge." End quote. They are always ready to feign humility when they get caught on the horns of an obvious intellectual dilemma. Eschatology and the second law. But creationists erroneously believe that they have achieved more of a victory than the idea of entropy entitles them to. The previously cited flyer asserts, quote, "Evolution demands that things wind up, even as we see them run down. Therefore, the evolutionist looks for things to improve." End quote. Again, what do we mean, improve? What things? For that matter, what does the evolutionist mean by improve? Pastor Tommy Reed has written an intelligent essay from a premillennial perspective, one which relies in part on the postmillennial optimism of David Chilton's book, Paradise Restored. Reed has also read Jeremy Rifkin. His observations are very significant for the thesis of this book, namely, that the use of the entropy concept in social theory leads to anti-Christian, socially paralyzing conclusions, as Rifkin understands so well. Quote, "Recent concepts have contributed to either a fatalistic or monastic attitude among other evangelicals, not the least of which is our modern emphasis on science. The rather recent discovery of the law of thermodynamics has shaped the philosophical view of the world held by some evangelicals. The second law of thermodynamics states that all matter and energy were created in this original state with an order and value to them. This is not a good statement of the second law, as held by conventional scientists. It does reflect the language of creation scientists. Gary North. That ordered state is continually being eroded by an irreversible natural process. According to this law of entropy, all matter and energy are constantly, and without exception, moving from an ordered to a disordered state. Many evangelicals have basically embraced this scientific view of matter and have applied it to society, with an attendant fatalism." End quote. The key word is fatalism. This is the heart of my critique of the use of the second law to construct social theory. What I argue is that this fatalism has in fact been imported from two sources. One, a popular though fading version of premillennial eschatology, one which Reed's article rejects, and two, an inapplicable version of 19th century physical science, one which evolutionists had been unwilling to apply to social theory until Rifkin appeared on the scene. Winding down. Let us pursue this wind up and run down analogy. Clocks, like galaxies, unquestionably run down over time, but this has nothing to do with the purposes, good or evil, to which clocks can be put. Furthermore, men can rewind clocks. Similarly, God can also, quote-unquote, rewind the universe or any aspect of the universe. He has done so in the past. If we feel compelled to use mechanistic analogies, we can call such a rewinding event a miracle. When Jesus healed sick people, multiplied fishes and loaves, churned water into wine, resurrected Lazarus from the dead, rose from the dead himself, and ascended into heaven, he overcame the entropy process, assuming that we equate the entropy process with the curse of Genesis 3:17-19 as creation science usually does. He quote-unquote rewound certain aspects of the unwinding cosmic clock. Why then should Christians cling frantically and fanatically to the doctrine of entropy as immutable? It clearly is not immutable. It is only a, most of the time, backdrop to life. One reason for this adherence to the second law by Christians is that most modern scientists today still hold such a view of the universe as a whole, the quote-unquote closed system of the supposedly uncreated universe. Since educated Christians want to be thought of as scientific, they adopt this commonly held entropic view of the long-term fate of the universe. In their attempt to defend the Christian faith scientifically, they give away too much of the case to their opponents. Another reason is this. They are really trying to defend their pessimistic eschatological views regarding the fate of the world prior to the return of Christ. They are what we might call pessimillennialists, and their emphasis on the scientific doctrine of entropy, the running down of the universe, has come as a result of their views of the timing of Christ's second coming. Science is not neutral. The emphases of scientists are not neutral. Eschatology matters in a theory of matter. A third reason is this. They have failed to think through the implications of the entropy process. But Rifkin has done so, and he is developing these implications as weapons to be used against Western civilization in general and against Christian conservatives in particular. Whether or not a creationist believes that God overcomes many of the effects of God's curse in the realm of human society depends on his view of ethics and eschatology, not on the scientific phenomenon called entropy. To de-emphasize the priority of ethics in explaining social entropy, in my view a misapplication of a concept taken from classical physics, thermodynamics, is simultaneously to de-emphasize the gospel and its positive effects in relation to the fall of man and the resulting curses. In short, some dispensational fundamentalists and traditional amillennialists who happen to be six-day creationists are probably unconsciously introducing their pessimistic eschatologies through the back door of the church in the name of quote-unquote irrefutable scientific law. This is not a legitimate intellectual procedure. It is also highly dangerous, as Pastor Reed recognizes. Quote, most evangelicals grew up within the confines of small, anemic, minority churches that were largely impotent insofar as changing the world was concerned. Now, evangelicals have awakened to a world in which they have power, prestige, and ability to bring about sociological change. Those who teach kingdom now hold that evangelicals must develop a theology of sociological responsibility, or we will again permit the liberals in Protestantism and the liberation theologians in Catholicism to shape our world, while we go merrily along awaiting the rapture. We need to remember how the church in Russia found itself, quote, arguing about the color of the drapes in the cathedral, end quote, while the atheists were building a newly reformed society around them, end quote. Henry Morris has remarked that the quote-unquote punctuated evolution theory of the younger Darwinian may well be the product of their graduate school experiences during the 1960s, and that the older evolutionists held to a gradual evolution view because they were educated during the era of the older quote-unquote gradualistic political liberalism. Tommy Reed has pointed to a similar relationship between the older fundamentalism's eschatological and social pessimism, as well as an attitude hostile to social reform, and the tiny and culturally impotent churches that served as the spiritual environment of that older movement. I would go one step farther. I think this pessimistic attitude strongly influenced their selection of the second law of thermodynamics as their primary scientific defense of creationism. These connections are not perfect, but I think they do exist in a loose sense, at least as tight as the relationship between the radicalism of the 1960s and the acceptance of punctuated evolutionism. Let us return to the previously mentioned flyer from the Bible Science Association. It also says that things tend to run down. What does this mean? If things only tend to run down, this implies that sometimes things don't run down. If so, there must be offsetting progressive forces in operation. What might these be? The main one is the gospel of salvation. Regeneration restores ethical wholeness to men. Another offsetting factor is obedience to the law of God. God's law enables men to rebuild a cursed world. In other words, ethics is fundamental. Entropy isn't. This is why entropy, to the extent that any such phenomenon applies to the universe as a whole, is only a tendency. The reason why I keep referring to this small document, tract, is because it is the one creationist document I have seen that even mentions social theory, and even then, only vaguely. I would have been happy to consider other documents from creation scientists that deal with entropy in relation to social theory, but I have been unable to find any. I searched the complete set of the Creation Social Sciences and Humanities Quarterly and found nothing on the topic. Why this silence on social theory? It may be that the entropy paradigm is so powerful that six-day creationists have become pessimistic about the possibility of constructing the foundations of a self-consciously biblical social science. Perhaps they have been baffled by the question, if entropy is the dominant factor in life, how can there be progress in social institutions, including the church? The answer that I offer is simple enough. The resurrection has made possible the historical overcoming of the cursed aspects of entropy in the physical universe, and to whatever extent that entropy-related curses affect social institutions, these effects can be offset even more rapidly than in the physical realm, because the three main institutions of society, family, church, and state, are covenantal. The closer we get to man, the more the covenant's sanctions of blessings and cursings become visible. The development of these ideas in Ray Sutton's book, That You May Prosper, gives a detailed defense of God's judgments in history, which are twofold: curses and blessings. The creation science movement and premillennialists in general have paid too little attention to God's covenantal blessings in history. They have focused their attention exclusively on the cursings. Ethics and entropy. This emphasis on entropy in the apologetic methodology of six-day creationists has clouded their thinking. The members of this movement in the past have generally been committed to the doctrine of the premillennial return of Christ. Most of the others have been amillennialists, either Lutherans or Calvinists, and they are even more committed to pessimism, for they do not acknowledge the possibility of the physical return of Jesus to rule prior to the final judgment. Dispensationalists see our present dispensation of the quote-unquote church age as under God's curse. They believe in continuing ethical decline, and therefore continuing social decline, before Jesus returns personally to set up a visible kingdom. They have a problem. They have great difficulty in explaining how modern man has reached today's pinnacle of economic, scientific, and technological glory. Even if social decline lies ahead, it is decline from something. Why are we so far ahead scientifically compared to where the founders of the faith were in Jesus' day? For that matter, why are we so far ahead of Moses? We possess mass-produced, inexpensive Bibles, satellite TV networks, radio stations, and other technological miracles which in fact are not miracles, but repeatable technologies in a world characterized by entropy. How can Christians account for the growing complexity of social life any more than evolutionists can account for the growing complexity of biological life? The biblical answer is ethics. God has blessed His holy word as it has been extended across the West. It is the abandonment of the gospel which now threatens the West, not the quote-unquote process of physical entropy as such. Scientific creationists have another problem if they are premillennialists. Will the return of Christ overcome the entropy process? Will the effects of entropy be in some way suspended, at least with respect to biology? Will people live longer and healthier? What about reducing quote-unquote social entropy? Will communications improve? That is, will noise be reduced? Will order begin to overcome randomness? If so, how? If not, what kind of millennium will that be? But if the effects of entropy can and will be overcome after Jesus returns bodily to reign, but before the final judgment and the transformation of the universe, then why can't we also argue that if men voluntarily begin to conform themselves to God's laws before Jesus returns physically, the cursed effects of entropy will be progressively overcome just as surely as after Jesus' premillennial return? Premillennialists argue that men will not repent in this fashion, but this begs the question. The question is, does God promise that the effects of His curse on man and nature can progressively be overcome, though not absolutely, in response to ethical regeneration? The biblical answer is clear. Yes. Deuteronomy 28, 1-14. Entropy is, at most, a backdrop, a kind of measurable down payment on the death that awaits all life apart from regeneration and ethical restoration. Entropy's effects can and have been overcome by righteousness. Miracles are real. So is regeneration. So is human progress. 2. Jeremy Rifkin's social pessimism. The same sorts of questions should be directed against Rifkin's social speculations. Rifkin has written 2 widely read and enthusiastically reviewed books that popularize a theory of static society: The Emerging Order, God in the Age of Scarcity, 1979, and Entropy, A New World View, 1980. These books are clear, well-written, and present a consistent, profoundly anti-Christian view of the world. Because of the consistency of his arguments and because of his anti-Christian conclusions presented in the name of a quote-unquote new Christianity, Rifkin's books deserve considerable attention. These are not scholarly books or immortal books. One cynical reviewer has gone so far as to say that what Rifkin offers in this book is a pop version of a worldview. Entropy is, to Vico, Toynbee, Hegel, and even Teilhart, what a McDonald's hamburger is to Hoyt cuisine. But let us not forget that McDonald's restructured the restaurant industry in the United States. McDonald's also changed people's tastes. Let us also not forget that Christians in our day are McDonald's people, not Hoyt cuisine people. So we need to consider Rifkin's books, not because they are profoundly original books, but because educated Christians and others have taken him seriously enough to buy lots of paperback copies. Even television evangelist Pat Robertson was lured into promoting Rifkin's Entropy in a pre-publication review of the book, which appeared in Pat Robertson's Perspective, June-July 1980, for which Constance Cumby has quite properly criticized him. Rifkin's books are very useful for contrasting the teachings of the Bible with those of an alien faith. Even more important, the alien nature of his faith has not been widely recognized by Christian reviewers, indicating a startling blindness intellectually and theologically, on the part of the reviewers. I believe that this blindness results from shared presuppositions. Blaming Christianity. Rifkin imports Eastern mysticism's view of social reality in the name of modern physical science. Predictably, he is hostile to Christian orthodoxy. Quote, "The fact is, we made a mistake. Our parents made a mistake, and so did theirs. It began a long time ago when God said to the first of our kind, 'You shall have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth.' We thought God meant for us to subdue the earth, to become its master." End quote. That, as he well knows, is precisely what God intended for man, to subdue the earth. This is the meaning of dominion. 2 verses later in Genesis we read, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." Genesis 1:28. Rifkin carefully avoids citing this verse. Rifkin knows exactly what he is doing. He is deliberately misleading his readers. His view of the historical relationship between the teachings of Christianity and the advent of pollution is conventional within the ranks of the zero-growth community, and I have commented negatively on this thesis elsewhere. This line of argument goes as follows. In the past, especially since the Protestant Reformation, Christianity taught dominion over nature. The attempt to exercise dominion over nature led to the exploitation of nature. Therefore, in order to avoid the exploitation of nature, Christians must abandon the theology of dominion over nature. Christianity didn't do it. I need to point out that this interpretation of the historical cause of ecological disruptions has also been called into question by René Dubos, a world-famous microbiologist and prominent leader in the ecology movement. In his book A God Within, 1972, he points to the history of man's relationship with nature, and he concludes that ecological devastation has not been a monopoly of Christian civilization. Quote, "Erosion of the land, destruction of animal and plant species, excessive exploitation of natural resources, and ecological disasters are not peculiar to the Judeo-Christian tradition and to scientific technology. At all times and all over the world, man's thoughtless interventions into nature have had a variety of disastrous consequences, or at least have changed profoundly the complexion of nature." End quote. Dubos comes as close as any non-theist can to calling these disasters judgments of God. Quote, "History is replete with ecological disasters. The most flourishing lands of antiquity seem to have been under a malediction." End quote. A malediction, evil speaking, is an oath of cursing, calling down evil on someone or something. The self-maledictory oath is the legal basis of the three biblical covenantal institutions: church, state, and family. He also lists the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, West Pakistan, and much of India, China, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. We could also list classical Greece and numerous primitive cultures. Quote, "All over the globe, and at all times in the past, men have pillaged nature and disturbed the ecological equilibrium. More than this, in fact, the Judeo-Christian peoples were probably the first to develop on a large scale a pervasive concern for land management and an ethic of nature." End quote. When a dedicated humanist and professional ecologist of Dubos' stature dismisses Rifkin's accusations against Christianity, we have to ask ourselves a key question. Is Rifkin being honest with the reader? Denying progress. Rifkin never mentions Dubos' summary. This is understandable, given his own commitment to Eastern mysticism. Rifkin's interpretation of what a reworked theology of dominion ought to teach would introduce to the West an Eastern static cosmology in the name of Christianity. He teaches an Eastern view of the fixed order of the creation, a view which does not grasp the implications of progressive cultural sanctification, meaning the building up, development, or recreation of the garden's image in time and on earth. Incredibly, he claims that he bases his new interpretation of the book of Genesis on the writings of several Protestant theologians, including Francis Schaeffer. It is unlikely that Schaeffer would have acknowledged the legitimacy of the following application of his work. Quote, "The new interpretation of Genesis," writes Rifkin, "begins with the idea that since God created the heavens and the earth and everything in this world, that all his creations take on importance and an intrinsic worth because they are of his making. Since the creation of gods has a purpose and order to it, that purpose and order is to be revered just as God's creations are to be revered. Finally, what God has created is fixed. The Lord created the world and everything in it, and then he rested, according to the creation story. It follows from this, argue the new theologians, that anything that exploits or harms God's creations is sinful and an act of rebellion against God himself. Likewise, anything that undermines the fixed purpose and order that God has given to the natural world is also sinful and an act of rebellion." End quote. Ethics and nature. Here we see a fundamental theological error, confusing the fixed order of ethics with the fixed order of nature. This may not seem like a serious error, but it is at the heart of the division between true and false religion. Is the uniformitarian principle ethical or is it biological? Should men honor the ethical laws of God or the status quo of nature? Are men subordinate to God or nature? Perhaps we can see the implications of Rifkin's theology by asking this question. Should the scientists in Britain who presently have in a laboratory the last known specimens of smallpox destroy these smallpox germs? The disease has been one of man's great scourges in history. It is transmitted only from man to man, and therefore it is one of the few known diseases that can be eradicated if it is separated from its host, man, for any length of time. The World Health Organization reports that since the late 1970s there have been no known outbreaks of the disease. The World Health Organization takes much of the credit for this victory over smallpox. Its officials prudently refuse to mention the damaging evidence that its years of inoculating Africans may have been the source of the initial spread of AIDS. Trading the minimal threat of smallpox for what may become the most deadly scourge in man's history is too great an embarrassment for messianic humanists. This means that the few organisms being artificially maintained in that laboratory in Britain are the last ones left alive on Earth, if the epidemiology of smallpox is correct and if there really have been no outbreaks of the disease. Should they be killed? It is obvious that a literal application of Rifkin's version of Genesis would prohibit the extermination of one of God's biological creations. Rifkin is straightforward. Quote, "Every species must be preserved simply because it has an inherent and inalienable right to life by virtue of its existence." End quote. It is equally obvious that a literal application of the Protestant version of the Dominion Covenant would encourage this particular quote-unquote exploitation of nature. Kill the creatures. Smallpox would be eradicated from the earth. There is sadly still a third view, neither Eastern nor Christian, the scientific view. Quote, "Keep the organisms alive so that scientists can conduct more research, even if there is a risk that the disease will get out of the laboratory and back into society at large." End quote. This may already have happened once. In 1978, a medical photographer for Birmingham University died of smallpox. She had been working one floor above the virology research department which had been involved in smallpox research. The autonomy of scientific research is placed above the welfare of society. What the Bible never teaches is the preservation of all life or all species, irrespective of the legitimate, though we can argue about what constitutes legitimate, needs of mankind. Care with nature, yes. Caution in introducing new species through genetic manipulation, yes. Care in moving one species to a new environment where it has few biological enemies, of course. But it is the needs of man, specifically the needs of a growing number of regenerate and morally sanctified people who act as God's lawfully delegated agents, as revealed in the Bible and through Bible-governed human wisdom, that must govern the dominion covenant. In other words, because there is a fixed moral order, there can be a progressive development of the creation under the auspices of man. As men begin to conform themselves to the terms of biblical law, they will exercise greater power, meaning long-term, God-honoring, man-satisfying power over the creation. This is what Genesis 1:26-28 is all about. Dubois, a non-Christian, has an inkling of this necessity of progress, although men will debate over the proper definition of progress. Quote, "The solution to the environmental crisis will not be found in a retreat from the Judeo-Christian tradition or from technological civilization. Rather, it will require a new definition of progress based on better knowledge of nature and on a willingness to change our ways of life accordingly." End quote. To abandon science and technology at this point in man's history would be suicidal and irresponsible. Rifkin versus private ownership. Rifkin at least understands the deeply theological nature of the competing world and life views. He understands it far better than most of his humanist peers and most of his Christian readers. He understands the importance of the attempt by non-Orthodox theologians to reinterpret the dominion covenant in the name of a, quote, new Reformation, end quote, which is in fact a revival of a non-Christian cosmology in the name of Christ. Quote, "By radically redefining humanity's relationship to the rest of God's creation, contemporary Christian scholars are thrusting a theological dagger directly into the heart of the expansionist epoch. The new concept of dominion as stewardship and conservation, rather than ownership and exploitation, is at loggerheads with both traditional Christian theology and the mechanical worldview of the past several hundred years. By refocusing the story of creation and humanity's purpose in the world, Christian theologians have committed an act of open rebellion against their own doctrinal past. The Christian individual who for hundreds of years sought salvation through productivity and subduing of nature is now being challenged by a new Christian person who seeks salvation by conserving and protecting God's creation. The Christian work ethic is being replaced by the Christian conservation ethic. This new emphasis on stewardship is providing the foundation for the emergence of a new Christian Reformation and a new covenant vision for society." End quote. Notice how Rifkin defines dominion as, quote, stewardship and conservation, in contrast to ownership and exploitation, by which he means private ownership. This is the language of all socialist theory, although he does not openly call for the socialization of the means of production, but he does call for state ownership of land and other quote-unquote non-renewable resources. In the quote-unquote ideal steady-state society, a zero-growth society which Rifkin advocates, quote, "The concept of private property will apply to consumer goods and services, but not land and other renewable and non-renewable resources. The long-accepted practice of private exploitation of natural resources will be replaced with the notion of public stewardship for the common good." End quote. In Entropy, he says the same thing, except here he refers to quote-unquote public guardianship. Rifkin explicitly rejects the idea that the competitive, open, free market is a means of dovetailing people's varying economic plans, a Christian concept which was secularized in the 18th and 19th centuries. Quote, "The orthodox economic view that each person's individual self-interest, when added up together, always serves the common good of the community is regarded with suspicion, or more appropriately, with outright derision." End quote. He deliberately creates a stickman to overcome. No prominent defender of traditional classical liberalism ever argued that individual self-interest always serves the common good. But more to the point, how is the preservation of the common good guaranteed by the control of land by tenured bureaucrats who operate officially under the overall authority of politicians? Politicians who cannot control much of what the bureaucrats do in the name of the common good. Implicit faith in bureaucracy. The Rifkins of the world seem to believe that their class, the articulate, formally educated class, will wind up in the positions of power in a bureaucratic society. They do not recognize the central skill of bureaucratic administration, the shuffling of papers, rather than the writing of books. Bureaucrats are seldom noted for their intellectual abilities. They are seldom articulate people. On the contrary, they are noted for their ability to adopt confusing language which communicates very little useful information to those outside the bureaucracy, or even inside. Intellectuals seldom understand the process by which bureaucracies overwhelm the political institutions of democracy. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, did understand, but his warnings have generally gone unheeded by the professional scholars. The democratization of society in its totality, Weber wrote, quote, is an especially favorable basis of bureaucratization, but by no means the only possible one, end quote. We cannot say that this increase in the power of bureaucracies is automatic, he said, but there are reasons to believe that modern political conditions are especially favorable for bureaucratic expansion. Quote, the power position of a fully developed bureaucracy is always great, under normal conditions, overtowering. The political quote-unquote master always finds himself, vis-a-vis the trained official, in the position of a dilettante facing the expert, end quote. Politicians lose control. The profit management system of capitalism at least keeps the quote-unquote experts in check by means of price competition, innovation, and the legal ability of consumers to say no. But this aspect of the market has not been understood by the vast majority of intellectuals in the 20th century. Rifkin is no exception. Waste is expensive. As we have already seen, he contrasts productivity with conservation. This is the language of the ecology movement, as well as most versions of Eastern religion that are popular in the West. I elsewhere discuss at some length the relationship between private ownership and the incentive to conserve assets, and the relationship between socialist ownership and the incentive to waste or consume quote-unquote free resources. Productivity in a free market must take into consideration all known costs of operation, and the free market encourages owners to discover formerly hidden costs in order to reduce them through greater efficiency. One of these costs is the cost of the reduced future value of capital assets that are being used up in any given production process. Waste is a cost to owners of capital assets. If owners can find a way to reduce waste or extend the productive life of their capital, they will do so if the possible changes cost less than the expected loss of capital value. There is always waste in every production process, for men are not omniscient and omnipotent. In short, they make mistakes. But in capitalist economies, it often pays owners to alter production processes in order to reduce waste. What capitalism does is to pressure profit-seeking owners of productive resources to put a price tag on waste. Owners determine which wasteful process should be borne for the sake of higher output, and which should be reduced for the sake of long-term preservation of capital asset value. It is therefore utterly misleading, both historically and in terms of economic theory, for Rifkin to complain that, quote, up to now there has been little public outcry over the exploitative and wasteful ways of the capitalist system, end quote. That such anti-capitalist propaganda is being taken seriously in the evangelical world points to the present intellectual bankruptcy of evangelicalism. Conclusion. Because the scientific creationists rely so heavily on the doctrine of entropy in building their case against the Darwinists, some of them have adopted a pessimistic view of human history that is remarkably similar to the view set forth by New Age theorist Jeremy Rifkin. Instead of simply using the entropy doctrine as a foil to embarrass the Darwinists, showing that their opponents are not really consistent in their proclamation of uniformitarianism, the scientific creationists actually adopt the theory in an attempt to develop a Christian alternative to scientific Darwinism. Rifkin's misuse of the entropy process to create a vision of social pessimism and the defeat of optimistic man has been imitated by those six-day creationists who have adopted the social entropy doctrine by way of scientific creationism. They too hold out no hope for society's progress prior to the second coming of Christ. Thus, we find that fundamentalists, charismatic, and neo-evangelicals have been unable, or at least unwilling, to challenge either Rifkin's Eastern theology or his third-rate social science. Their eschatological pessimism has played into his grasping hands. It has aided Rifkin in his self-conscious attempt to capture the minds of the charismatic and neo-evangelical leadership during a period which he recognizes as being potentially a second Protestant Reformation. In summary, 1. Men's religious views of the world influence the kinds of science they do. 2. The theology of the creation science movement influences their selection of arguments. 3. Their pessimistic eschatology has shaped their use of the second law of thermodynamics. 4. Jeremy Rifkin has attempted to apply natural science to social theory. 5. He has also selected the second law as the key idea in his system. 6. The evangelical world has failed to place Christ's resurrection at the center of its view of time, judgment, and society. 7. Creation scientists emphasize Adam's fall, God's curse, and the decay of the universe. 8. Their reliance on the entropy concept has placed them at the mercy of Rifkin. 9. The pessimism of creation science is based on its eschatology and its reliance on the second law. 10. They see no long-term improvement for the world. 11. They cannot explain the improvement we have seen without calling into question their apologetic methodology, the second law. 12. Rifkin exploits this weakness. 13. He appeals to the pessimistic eschatologies of his targeted audience, evangelical Christians. 14. A kind of fatalism concerning the world has overwhelmed Christian social thinkers. 15. The world is wound back up by miracles. 16. Obviously, entropy is not universally binding. 17. Christians have not paid sufficient attention to the healing effects of righteousness. 18. Ethics is fundamental. Entropy isn't. 19. How can we explain Western history without a concept of progress? 20. What threatens the West is its abandonment of the gospel, not entropy. 21. The cursed effects of entropy can and have been overcome. 22. Rifkin blames Christianity for the crises of the West. 23. He rejects the biblical idea of dominion by covenant. 24. He ignores the evidence presented by other scientists that Christianity isn't to blame. 25. Rifkin denies that scientific progress is truly progress. 26. He confuses the fixed order of ethics with the supposedly fixed order of physical nature. 27. Rifkin also rejects the free market economy. 28. He denies the desirability of economic growth. 29. He has an implicit faith in bureaucracy. 30. The scientific creationists have adopted a similar view of society, one that cannot be healed by Christ in history.